thank you all for being here. This is my first time to be a moderator, and so I'm going to give it my best shot. I've enjoyed meeting our two authors, and I think the material that we're going to talk about today, I think you're going to find very interesting. I read both books and thoroughly enjoyed both of them and learned a lot. As I told somebody, I actually filled a void in my history that I didn't really realize I needed to fill in a couple of cases. But both were great books, and I think we're going to enjoy hearing about those today. So I'll just go ahead and start, and we'll get going and introduce our authors here today. Sitting next to me is Eric J. Dolin. He's written 16 books, winning many awards along the way, including Nonfiction Book of the Year, John Lyman Award for U.S. Maritime History, Franz Tavern Museum Book Award, the Samuel Eliot Morrison Book Award for Navy Literature. He was also chosen for the Atmospheric Science Librarians International Choice Award for History. And he lives in Marblehead, Massachusetts with his family. And so we welcome him here. The book that we're going to discuss today that he wrote is his latest book is called Left for Dead, Shipwreck, Treachery, and Survival at the Edge of the World. It's a very interesting book. Happens during the War of 1812. A lot of history there that I was unaware of that I found very fascinating. I will say this: there was one review that stuck with me. A Wall Street Journal review said that the book was a tale with all the elements of a movie blockbuster: shipwreck, mutiny, greed, struggle for survival in a hostile environment, and as if a movie executive had insisted it could only help at the box office a dog. And so anyway, I found the book very, very, very fascinating. Our other authors with us today grew up in the Memphis area, but now lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The author of the New York Times best-selling Histories on the Desperate Ground, In the Kingdom of Ice, Hellbound on His Trail, Blood and Thunder, and Ghost Soldiers, and which won the Penn USA Award for nonfiction. And as I say, lives in Santa Fe. And welcome to the Capitol.
Yeah, good to be here.
And his latest book that we're going to talk about today is The Wide, Wide Sea: Imperial Ambition, First Contact, and Fateful Final Voyage of Captain James Cook. Very fascinating book. I learned a lot about history in that book also. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And I guess we'll start with you, Eric, if that's okay.
Okay.
And so could you give us a summary, or maybe talk about just a little bit about the book and Captain Charles Barnard?
Sure. I have to say, despite that Wall Street Journal review saying that this book should be made into a movie, Hollywood has not contacted me yet. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed. But anyway, Left for Dead is a true story of a wild and fateful encounter between an American sealing vessel, a shipwrecked British brig, and a British warship in the Falkland Islands during the War of 1812. It was fraught with misunderstanding and mistrust, a lot of twists and turns. The incident left 3 British sailors and 2 Americans, including the captain of the American sealer, Charles Barnard, marooned intentionally in the Falkland Islands for 18 months. So there are 40-something chapters in this book. There's a lot of detail. I will try to give you the highlights. Basically, on April of 1812, the Nanina, the British sealing vessel, left New York Harbor, went down to the Falkland Islands. They were going there to hunt for seals, to strip them of their pelts, and sell those seals in China. They made it to the Falklands in September of 1812. The war had not begun yet. They began sealing, and then in January, an American ship came by and said, you know what? The war broke out the previous June. According to their contract, the men of the Nanina were required to go back to the nearest American port should war break out. Well, they decided not to do that. They said it's better for us to continue sealing rather than go back and risk getting caught by a British warship. So they continued sealing, and they thought that they were completely alone. But then in April of 1813, they see smoke rising off of an island in the distance. They go to investigate, and they discover the shipwreck of the Isabella, a British brig. A few months before, a few months, in December of 1812, the British brig, the Isabella, with 54 people on board, left New South Wales, the penal colony, the British penal colony, in what today is Australia. They went around Cape Horn. They nearly crashed south of New Zealand. They went around Cape Horn. There are 54 people on board. There are 14 Marines, armed Marines. There are 10 ex-convicts, including 4 prostitutes who had served out their time and were going back to London. The captain of the ship was a drunkard, and he liked to spend more time in the cabin with one of the prostitutes than he did sailing, and that came back to bite him when they crashed into Eagle Island on the Falkland Islands. All 54 people survived. So when Barnard and his men went to investigate, they discovered this shipwreck. Barnard quickly realized that these people knew nothing about the war breaking out. He told them, and then he also made a humanitarian offer. He said, I am willing to save all of you, bring you to South America so that you can get a trip back to London, as long as you give me salvage rights to the Isabella and the right to take any cargo that is not personal property. They were thrilled with this. They said, absolutely, we will do it. Thank you very much. So Barnard takes some of his men and 22 of the British about 100 miles away to get the Nanina ready to leave the Falklands. They're getting ready. There are a bunch of British Marines with Barnard, and for reasons you'll have to read the book, the British overwhelm the Americans and say, we need to go back to Eagle Island right away, get the other British people, and leave. But the problem was Charles Barnard and 4 other men had gone to a neighboring island to hunt hogs and capture wildfowl to feed these people who were quickly running out of food. So another humanitarian gesture on Barnard's part. Well, the British are urging them to go back, not urging them, forcing them to go back to Eagle Island. One of the Americans gets a concession. They're going to stop at the island where the hunting party is and pick them up. But when they get to the island, they renege on that deal, and they keep going. And the Americans, including Charles Barnard's father, are apoplectic, but they can't do anything about it. So they go back to Eagle Island, leaving the 5 men behind on Beaver Island, which incidentally has no beaver. But anyway, so they leave them behind on Beaver Island, and then when they get back to Eagle Island, there's a British warship there, the Nancy, because when the Isabella crashed, they took their 17-and-a-half-foot boat and they sent 6 men off on a 1,200-mile open ocean journey to Buenos Aires to get help. Nobody knew if they'd be successful. In fact, they thought they had sunk. They made it there, and the Nancy, the British warship, was the result. Well, the captain of the British warship was a real piece of work. This guy, Duranda, he knew about the agreement between the Americans and the British for the Americans to save the British. He said, I don't care. He ripped up that agreement. He said the Nanina is a prize of mine, British warship, and all the Americans are prisoners of war. Not a single British person who was going to be rescued by the kindly Americans spoke up on behalf of the Americans, so they start getting ready to leave. The Americans who were there, who are now prisoners of war, pleaded with Duranda, you have to go back to Beaver Island and rescue the 5 hunters, including 3 of them are British sailors. Well, Duranda says, no, no, no. After 4 weeks, he finally relents. He sends 1 rowboat with 3 men who don't know their way around the Falklands across Falkland Island Sound. They're about 40 miles short of Beaver Island. They come back in 3 days, didn't find anybody, of course, and in about 5 more days, the Nancy and the Nanina leave for Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro. So now we go back to the 5 men. They survived for 534 days. They had hardly anything with them when they went to Beaver Island, just knives, a couple of clubs, 1 set of clothes, and a little bit of food, and Charles Barnard's trusty dog, Scent, who is great when hunting hogs. And so they are at this island, and they don't know what's happened. They go back to the island, the place where the Nanina last was, and it's gone. And for a month, they try desperately to get back to Eagle Island, where they think that the Nanina might be, but they got lost, they go back, that's it. So they're there, and they have to survive. They start making clothes out of seal skins. They eat a lot of hogs. Luckily, back in this time, there's no concern about cholesterol, because these guys ate penguin and albatross eggs by the armful every day, and they didn't really eat much seal, which was kind of curious to me. But they survived for 534 days. The whale ships, the Asp and the Indispensable, come and save them. On the very day that they are rescued from the Falklands, that is the day that back in London, the Admiralty Court is hearing the case as to whether the Nanina is a valid prize for Captain Peter Duranda. If it is, he and his men get to split the proceeds from selling the Nanina and all of its cargo. So it's kind of a funny coincidence that the day that Barnard is rescued, they're deciding the fate of his ship thousands of miles away. So the rest of the story, and it goes on. I'll tell you the punchline at the end. I mean, Barnard getting back home is an experience in its own. But at the end, Peter Duranda loses his court case. He's left with nothing. The Nanina and its cargo and all the value is returned to the owners of the Nanina. And for the rest of his life, Peter Duranda complains about this turn of events. And the one other thing I will add, there's a great article in the book that I quote. When some of the Americans got back from South America and told the story of the 5 hunters who've been left behind, it is one of the greatest examples of pro-American jingoistic, journalism painting these British people. It basically says, we know the British people are low, but man, what they did, this is even beyond the pale. And I just, anyway, that's sort of the summary in a nutshell.
Well, you started off with the fact that the war had been going on some 6 or 8 months before they knew anything about it.
Right.
And I guess I was a little today with our ability to communicate with anybody anytime. It's hard for us to relate to the lack of communications in the 18th, 19th century. It's just.
Oh no, it's amazing. One of the things that interests me about the Great Age of Sail, a lot of my books are about the Great Age of Sail, is just that. They leave port. They don't have GPS. They don't have weather forecasts. They're gone for sometimes 6 months, a year, 3-4 years. Whaling, I wrote a book on whaling. They're gone for an average of 4 years, away from everybody they know. They go to places where they don't have maps. They encounter dangers. Sometimes they encounter natives that are not always friendly, not in the case of the Falklands. And it's just a way of life. This guy, Charles Barnard, he was a seasoned captain. He was away from the United States more than he was there. And that seems to be the same story for so many of these mariners, certainly the story for Captain Cook. And they just are, their mistress is the sea. What's that Brandy, what's that song? Brandy, no. Mistress is the sea. Anyway, it is amazing. And just think about if you're away and you have no idea what's happening in the world for a year or 2 years, and then you come back and you get an information dump. Just totally different from today.
So, from a historical perspective, as opposed to James Cook, Captain James Cook and his voyage, he was very well known, a lot of history, a lot of things written about him. Your Captain Barnard is not a famous character. No. So how did you deal with the historical record once you decided to go with something about him? Where did you go to do the history about him? How did you find that?
Well, I'll wrap it in because I know you have a future question. I'll sort of wrap it in, how I came up with this story and how I did the research. Most of the time, the books that I write, something in the current book I'm working on sparks my interest. That was not the case here. I was looking around for an idea. I wanted to stay in the maritime sphere, even though someday I'll probably move out of that again to do something else. And I found this book from the late 1970s, written by an English professor. It's basically a compilation of all the shipwrecks and disasters from 1580 to 1860 with a paragraph each. And I'm flipping through it, and they talk about, oh, that's Hampton Side's book, Kingdom Ice. Oh, that's In the Heart of the Sea, Nathaniel Philbrick. All these little summaries of great maritime stories that you've all heard about, the wreck of the Medusa. And then I came upon this paragraph that talked about Charles Barnard being marooned on the Falkland Islands. I'd never heard about it. And right below it, it said he wrote his autobiography. He wrote a biography or a story about his time on the Falklands that was published in 1829. So I got my hands on that, and I read it. I thought it was fascinating, and then I had to decide, is there enough information to write a whole book? Because he's an unknown character. And fortunately, between the newspaper articles, between his account, between 3 or 4 accounts from people who survived, both British and American, and 3 or 4 logbooks, and a court case that happened in London. I love the British Archives. They keep everything. And not only do they do that, they digitize it. So there was enough to write a book. But I want to say one thing. It's an interesting distinction. Captain James Cook, famous. You probably all have heard about him. I explicitly, when I was reading about this guy, my agent's always telling me the famous man or woman theory of books. You need to write books about famous topics, people that are famous, that even though there have been 16,000 books on, this person or that person or the Civil War, that's something to do. And I specifically chose this because he was unknown. And I wanted to see how just regular people who made no mark on history before or after this event dealt with good times and bad times, treachery, dishonesty, and humanitarian impulses, and everything rolled into one. So it's just a story about the maritime, great age of sail, regular people. Once they got back, they melted into background, and you never heard about them again. And I just thought it was interesting. But judging by how well Hampton's books do and how well mine do, I should do what he does. I should write about more famous people.
Well, let me ask you one last question, and then we'll kind of move on. Were there any big surprises or challenges while you were doing your research?
Well, one of the big surprises, I actually was surprised that this guy, Captain Peter Duranda, the British guy, was such a horrible person. And even though the Americans had done the right thing, that he overlooked that because he wanted a prize of war and the glory of having a prize of war. And I was also very disappointed in the British people who were there, and not a single one of them spoke up. Even one of them wrote afterwards, about 10 years later, something to the effect, closed mouth, saves your skin or something. These people did not have guts. They did not do the right thing. So that really disappointed me.
Well, let's let our other author talk a little bit, and could you give us somewhat of a summary of your book?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's good to be here in lovely Jackson, Mississippi, which I think is maybe the only place that Captain Cook didn't go to. Captain Cook is the subject of my book, his third and final voyage around the world. He's not actually that well known, I found, in the United States. He's often confused with other captains, real and imaginary. Captain Kirk, Captain Kidd, and most often I got this. People thought I was writing about a pirate named Captain Hook from Peter Pan. Literally, people say, "How's your book on the pirate coming along?" And I have to explain. This is a book about a British captain who was perhaps the greatest nautical explorer of all time, who met a very graphic and very violent death on the big island of Hawaii. And he went out on his third and final voyage. As you said, he was a very famous man by that point. And he was trying to find the Northwest Passage over the top of Canada. Going through the Pacific Ocean, he stumbled upon this amazing archipelago that we call Hawaii, and had a very, very powerful and ultimately very tragic attraction to this place. I knew that this panel, when I saw that it was going to be titled Maritime Madness, that we're going to have a good time. There's so much crossover. There's something about these maritime tales. They're the classic themes. There's mutiny. There's of course scurvy. There's cannibalism sometimes. Horrible diets like albatross, omelets or whatever. And in fact, we talked about, particularly since it's about a guy named Cook, that we should have a companion cookbook to go with this thing, because they're eating atrociously bad food inevitably on these voyages. So many other themes about leadership, decisions that were made or perhaps weren't made that led to the survival or led to the death of the main characters. All these sorts of questions come into play, I think, almost with every nautical story, but particularly this one. It's a story that took me around the world in pursuit of it. Luckily, Captain Cook had this unbelievable tendency to anchor at just absolutely beautiful places. Thank you very much. In New Zealand, Tasmania, Australia, Tonga, the Cook Islands, of course, Hawaii and Alaska. I guess I was drawn to this story in part because of the timing of it. It's about a British captain and a British voyage, but it's also very much an American story. They left in July of 1776 from Plymouth, England, just as this thing was starting to heat up in Boston, and they just barely missed it and didn't get the memo about this thing called the Declaration of Independence. And as they're on this voyage, exploring the coast of Oregon and Washington and Alaska and of course Hawaii, they're completely oblivious to this other development that's happened and is happening on the other side of the continent. There are American-born sailors on board the ship, including the captain who will ultimately bring the ships home, who was born and raised in Virginia. And these sailors have, at the end of their voyage in 1780, the American Revolution is almost over, and they have to make a pretty powerful, pretty profound decision. When they get home and they find out what's been going on, they have to ask the question: am I American or am I British? Some of them go back to America and fight for the American colonies. Others stay in England, but. So there's all these different themes going on, and I guess similar to your book, 1812. The tensions between America and Britain also figure very much into my story as well.
So, kind of going back to a question I asked earlier, whereas Bernard was almost totally unknown to anybody, you had in your research, I would assume you had with British archives and American stories and lots of books have been written about James Cook. So I guess, how did you approach your research?
So Captain Cook certainly wrote a lot himself. These, journals that he kept were very meticulous. But what's interesting is, like, by the third voyage, Captain Cook was so famous that anyone on board the two ships that left England who was halfway literate was keeping a journal, at least secretly. They understood this was going to be an important voyage, and they understood that this was going to be something that the reading public was going to be interested in. So the upshot of that is that I had this profusion of written material to work with that I try to quote from, even more than Captain Cook, from other explorers, other officers, various people on board, including a young man named William Bligh, who will go on to become a very famous, notorious captain with the mutiny on the Bounty. And another young officer named George Vancouver is on board. He's keeping notes. An American explorer born and raised in Connecticut named John Ledyard is there, keeping a journal. So I would say that the lion's share of the book is really triangulating all the things that these officers are saying with all the things that Captain Cook is saying in his descriptions, his logs and journals. And then the third piece that I try to use as much as possible, and what is remarkable about Captain Cook's voyages is that he had so many encounters with, and often first contact encounters with people all over the Pacific. So I'm trying to incorporate oral history from the Polynesian side of the question and using as much of that as I possibly can to give, hopefully, a three-dimensional portrait of these remarkable experiences. There's this something very magical that happens when two cultures meet each other for the first time. Anything can happen. Is it going to be violent? Is it going to be friendly? Are they going to trade? Is it going to erupt into warfare? And time and time and time again, Cook had these experiences throughout his 3 voyages, and I think that is the real moment of awe and wonder, but also tension that drew me to this story more than anything, was that those moments, pure moments of first contact that could go in any direction, and how those worked out. And they generally, what's remarkable is that they worked very well for Captain Cook so many times. And then finally, one day, it didn't work out for him.
It didn't work out.
And things go very, very, very wrong in a hurry for the captain. So, so all roads kind of lead down to the events on the Big Island in 1779.
Can I
Go
say
ahead.
something about
Yeah,
that?
sure.
It's curious. My book didn't have a huge amount of information. It had enough to write the book. So in that sense, it was easier. But every other book I've written, almost every other book, is sort of similar to Captain Cook, the example there, because there was a huge amount of information. In fact, there's a flood of information. And what's happened in book writing is when I started writing books, which was about 20 some odd years ago, the internet was not nearly as all-consuming. Now, just sitting at your computer, you can get digital copies of almost anything. You could be overwhelmed. Imagine writing a book about whaling like he did, 400 years of history. And I always remember advice one of my professors gave me, and it wasn't fresh to him, but he said, don't let better be the enemy of good enough. And I think the biggest thing that I have always had to do as a writer, not so much in this book, and maybe Hampton has the same situation, is deciding, you get a sense, you know that you have enough to tell the story you want to tell. Any of these books that we've written, I think any of them, we could have spent 5, well, sometimes you did, 10 years, 15 years writing. But you got to finish the book and you want to go on to something else. So trying to manage information and decide what's important and what isn't is difficult. I think it's a skill that you acquire, and some people do it better than others, but with the evolution of social media, I truly believe that people's attention is decreasing. So you have to really even work harder not to lose your reader, because after all, we're writing popular narratives. We're not academics. We want people to read the books. And so it's an interesting challenge, but it can be fun.
I think someone asked me a question while I was on the book tour, because I have the same problem you do. There's so many stories to tell, and there's only so many pages in a book. So they asked the question, how do you keep from chasing rabbits? And just there's so many rabbit holes that you can go down. And my answer was, I only try to chase the rabbits I think I can catch. Where there's going to be some payoff that you can at least see coming. And I think that's so true with all narrative history, is that you gotta have a pretty good sense that this is a rabbit I can catch. There's going to be a reason. There's going to be there's going to be some kind of benefit to this story. Otherwise, you spend the rest of your life. You could have spent the rest of your life researching this story, and I certainly could have spent the rest of my life researching Captain Cook. So it also helps when you have an editor who is looking at the calendar and has a sense of deadlines, and it helps when you have a wife too, who really wants you to turn in the book so you can get paid. There are many other incentives to help you stop chasing rabbits.
So, so in his particular thing, in my reading of the book, as you said, it was interesting to see how many times he visited someplace for the first time. Yeah. And met people for the first time. And many times it was the first time those people had ever met a white person or an English person or someone that was different. Yeah. And I thought that was interesting. So I guess in doing your research, did you visit any of the sites talked about in the book? I know you talked about the oral history. Right. And I know in the book you talked about that a little bit too. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, I really think it's important. And Eric, I'm sure you agree, it's really important to go to the places you're writing about, if at all possible, within the confines of, finances and, in this case, a global pandemic that kept me from going to some of these islands. And it also helps, as I said earlier, that these were nice places. I did spend a good bit of time in Hawaii. I did spend a good bit of time, about a month in New Zealand, and Tahiti, the Society Islands. Yeah, I mean, there was a historian who once said Captain Cook's ship seemed to be pulled toward islands as if by magnetic attraction. He's just wandering around in the ocean, and he comes upon, and is often the very first European to come upon, island after island after island after island. And if he's not the first, he's the second, let's say, or the third. So he's having genuine first contact experiences repeatedly. And he's learning a lot. I mean, one of the lessons that Cook extrapolates from his travels is that because he's learned some Polynesian, he's learned to speak at least kind of pidgin Polynesian, he's starting to understand these are the same people, the same culture. These people must have been long-distance voyagers themselves, just like we are. He tried to understand how they did it on the ships that they had without any metal, without nails, without rivets, without how did they construct these vessels that were able to withstand these huge voyages? So he's really the first European explorer who's beginning to puzzle over this question of the Polynesian diaspora, and realizing that at least long ago they must have been very savvy mariners, and he's amazed. He's amazed, and and what I like to think about is, what would have happened if, these amazing long-distance voyagers, the Polynesians, what if they had come and discovered England first? What if they had shown up at Plymouth, England, perhaps during the Stone Age? And, what would the English, they weren't even the English then, what would these Stone Age people think of these amazing mariners, and how would history have gone in a different direction?
Yeah. Well, go ahead.
I have to say that Hampton did a much better job of picking locations for this book. I mean, the Falklands was not on the top of my bucket list, and I made a conscious decision. I did not visit the Falklands, and that is because, even though the Falklands is a major character in the book, because there are a number of accounts I was able to find from mariners in the early 1800s writing about the Falklands. I'm not writing about the Falklands today, even though it looks quite similar. So I made that decision, and I think I made the right decision, because one of the people that blurbed my book is Menson Bound, who grew up on New Island, which I write about in the Falklands. He's the guy that helped, he was the head of the archaeological discovery, the Endurance, Shackleton's voyage, this ship this last summer. And he wrote me in an email, along with the blurb, he said, "You captured the Falklands beautifully." However, I was on Falklands TV, and I think 6 people were tuned in to watch me. And I said, if I sell enough copies, I'll come visit. As far as I know, so far, that's not going to happen. But if it was a nicer location, but I used to have this flip answer. I don't know if it's flip, but people always ask me about, did I visit places? I wrote a book about whaling. I never killed a whale. I wrote a book about the fur trade. I never killed a beaver. I wrote a book about China, and all my books are translated into Chinese, and I've never been to China. So I'm not advocating not experiencing. I would love to have gone to New Zealand and all those places. It's just when the books that I've written, I don't think they suffered because I didn't go to some of these places. I mean, for the whaling book, I did. But in the future, I would love, I'm writing a book, we'll talk about it later. I'm writing a book now that happens in Micronesia. I don't know if I'm going to visit there, but it would be nice, but again, I don't think it was necessary for the purposes of this book.
One follow-up question for Hampton. In reading the book, there was a number of things that jumped out at me. One was, and you've talked about Cook and the things that he discovered and so forth, but he was also a very good map maker. And he mapped a lot of places. And one of the things that came out in the book was that he tested the clock that allowed them to more accurately define where longitudes were. So as he started discovering these islands, once he had that information and he plotted an island, the locations were pretty accurate.
Yeah.
And so those islands after that were visited by other people who now knew where they were.
Right.
Is that
It's so important that Captain Cook was the beneficiary of a number of advances, but none more important than the chronometer, this clock that you're talking about, which allowed him fairly quickly to establish longitude, and they already had figured out latitude. So now you have the situation where, like in the old days, sailors would find a place, and then they go back to port and they would say, "Well, what did you find?" And they say, "Well, you sail south for 4 weeks, and then you sail east for a month, and you might find it somewhere." They couldn't tell you where they had been, and so this chronometer thing not only allowed him to know precisely what the coordinates were, but because he was such an accurate and meticulous map maker, and that was really his genius and his real skill was as a cartographer, he was able to put these places literally on the map, and maps that were widely published around the world. And now you have these places that had been sort of blissfully isolated for centuries, if not millennia, that are. And he's like broadcast their location. And so here come the sealers and the whalers and the armies and then here comes the alcohol and the pathogens and the missionaries, and very quickly these often quite fragile Polynesian and other island societies very quickly unravel. So this is why Captain Cook today is. He's become a symbol of colonialism, even though he was really just primarily an explorer. Because he put these places on the map, he's become the symbol of colonialism. His statues are coming down. His memorials have been splattered with paint and literally hacked from their plinths. They're coming down. So there's a reckoning going on. There's controversy surrounding him and other explorers of his era. Which to me just made him even that much more interesting. That you have this bewigged guy with a tricorn hat, 250 years old now, is in the news again.
Yeah.
And gives the story a little bit of a pulse, a little bit of a live wire that it might not otherwise have had.
You spoke earlier of the journals that other people on the ships were keeping, and one thing I found interesting was in one of those journals, and I don't remember who wrote it, but one of the journals contained a line where he talked about the Hawaiian people riding the waves on a 7-foot board that was 7 foot long and 2 foot wide, and the surfing community now says that's the first recorded story about someone actually surfing. Is that?
Yeah, there was an officer named Samuel who was with Cook on this voyage, and they were just gobsmacked by this thing that the Hawaiians were doing, men and women. That this is particularly interesting because British sailors, even British officers, often did not know how to swim. They weren't required to learn how to swim, which is just unbelievable to me. Let alone know how to surf. So these descriptions, this guy Samuel, he's trying to break down the biomechanics. He's trying to sort of, understand how do they do this. They get up on these boards on the declivity of the wave, and use all this high-minded English to try to describe what we now know as surfing, because he doesn't think the people back in England will even believe him.
Yeah.
It's like they're flying, or they're doing some exotic and almost supernatural sport here.
Yeah.
So yeah, and Captain Cook's voyages do have so many of these firsts. Like the first description of the haka dance, or the first description of or at least detailed description of tattooing, first description of a human sacrifice in Tahiti, the first use of the chronometer, proving the use that this chronometer works, the first description of the hula dance. On and on and on it goes, and I think it's not always Cook himself. It's sometimes it's one of the scientists on board or some of his officers, but there is just something about, and it's perhaps the reason why there's so many books have been written about Cook's voyages, is there's just so much stuff that came from them and were widely published. And, you can really spend a lifetime trying to master just the literature of Cook's three voyages. And I tried to do it with just one.
What about the young man, the Polynesian, who Cook brought back actually on his second trip back to England?
Right.
Who was he?
So yeah, there's another major character in the book that I really wanted to have a Polynesian character, considering this is a story largely set in Polynesia. And I'll just say that there's an amazing Polynesian character in the book named Mai, who was the first Polynesian to arrive in England and ever set foot on English soil as part of Cook's second voyage around the world. And he spent 2 years in England. He was treated like a king. He ate like a king. He was given all these fine clothes to wear. He learned English. He was vaccinated for smallpox. He met King George. He met all the leading scientists. He was paraded around London as sort of like the epitome of the noble savage, as they called him. And he had a ball, and the ladies loved him. He was a good-looking young man, and he learned to hunt, and he collected muskets and ammunition and all these presents. But after 2 years, he was homesick, and he wanted to get back to Tahiti. And Captain Cook, the very first errand of the voyage is to bring him home to Tahiti with all these belongings. And it's really the story of sort of like cultural cross-pollination and how this young man now, he's kind of confused. He's sort of Polynesian, but he's sort of English. He's got all these possessions now. He's got guns. He's got a full suit of armor, if you can believe it. Horses, which the Polynesians had never seen before. And he's deposited on this island. And so I tell the story also of what happened to him after Cook left. And it's a very bittersweet tale.
Interesting character. I think we're down to the last few minutes. Could each of you kind of talk about maybe what you're working on now for the future and maybe what we can expect?
Sure. Yeah, I'm working on a book about a whaling voyage in the 1830s that ended up crashing into the island of Palau. And in this one, there are natives involved. There's tattooing, there's murder, there's a lot of death, there's a naval expedition to go rescue them. There's also a story about some natives that are brought back to England and how they're treated. That seemed to be a huge thing, late 1700s to the early 1800s. It's a fun and disturbing book to write. I mean, it's got some elements that are a little disturbing, but it's just fascinating learning about another culture, and it's bringing me back a little bit to my roots, because one of my earliest books was about the history of whaling, and people seem to be always interested in that. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Are you going to go to Palau?
I don't know if it's a possibility. But listen, my wife told me never to say this, but I'm gonna say it. Just the reality. That's my wife talking to me now. The reality of writing is, you get in advance. The travel you do, and Hampton might have a different arrangement, but the travel you do comes out of your own pocket. I don't make that much money that a trip to Palau is an insignificant expense, and I just bought a new house 3 days ago. So I'm not sure I'm going to Palau because, again, I have so much historical information on what Palau was like in the early 1800s. Going there, although I'd love to, and I'd love to scuba dive there, I don't think is going to make for a better book. But if you all buy a lot of copies of my books, that might change.
Yeah, so I'm done with the sea for a while. I'm moving inland. My next book is very terrestrial. It's mostly set in Colorado Territory during the Civil War. And it concerns a lot of different events, including the gold rush and the creation of Denver, the creation of the Colorado Territory, some Civil War battles. But it all leads to a story about something called the Sand Creek Massacre, which was a horrific event that happened to the Cheyenne Indians in 1864. So not as much travel this time around. I'm going to be. I live in New Mexico. I'll be spending a lot of time in Denver, and perhaps at the National Archives in Washington, and a few other places. But I'm usually pretty superstitious about talking about my next book.
Yeah.
So I don't think I'll say anything more until I somehow I always fear it's not going to get written if I talk about it too much. But that is the gist of what I'm doing now. So.
Okay. Well, I think we have maybe a couple of minutes. If anybody has a question, we've got
Got a couple.
let's see, we got one right here. Right here.
No, not in this. No, I don't know if there are any dodos there. A lot of albatrosses. Yeah, I thought they were in Madagascar, but in Africa.
Bly. Yeah, two mutinies against the same guy. Yeah, he had an insufferable personality, and people couldn't stand him. But he was an incredible mariner, and incredibly proficient, and learned so much of what he knew from his time with Captain Cook.
Young lady right back here, you had a question? Yes.
Well, at the end of the voyage, they were supposed to collect anything that anyone wrote. The Admiralty wanted to get their hands on anything, so any unauthorized accounts, right? But some slipped through, or some people maybe didn't turn in their notes. The Admiralty very much discouraged them from publishing these accounts. They wanted the official account to come out first. But nonetheless, people did it anyway. There was just too much money to be made. And I mentioned John Ledyard, the American explorer. When he got to America, he published this book, his account of the journey, and it became the very first book copyrighted in the United States, the brand new United States of America. So these journals were. The Admiralty frowned upon this sort of thing. They like the official account to be the definitive and first account. I don't know if that's.
We had a question right here.
Yeah. I mean, the question is about property, communal property in Polynesia versus sort of the British attitude of like, this is mine, you can't have it, and especially things made of metal, because the Polynesians did not have metal, and they were just fascinated and even obsessed with metal, so much so that they would be prying the nails out of the sheathing of the ship, and Captain Cook was worried the ship was going to fall apart, and anything like a sextant or a quadrant or a hammer or an awl, anything made of metal was likely to be stolen. And this just drove Captain Cook crazy, trying to hunt down the perpetrator and get the thing back. Sometimes it wasn't a valuable thing. Other times it was a very important tool, like a quadrant. Not only that, but it wasn't his property. It was, as he viewed it, it was the property of the Royal Navy and the Admiralty. So he was required to hunt down those things. But that very dynamic is what leads to his death in Hawaii, because, I don't think he fully understood this idea that for most of the Polynesians, property was communal. They didn't have a whole lot of physical objects. They had very different ideas about personal possessions. And that clash is really something that happens repeatedly throughout the voyage in lesser or greater degrees of severity till it finally leads to his death. And I haven't talked about his death, but the last 60 pages of the book are just about all the things that led to it, and it's very graphic, it's very disturbing, and it's there's still some sort of shock waves. And of all the travels that I did, the one place that I had to go to was the spot where he was killed on the Big Island. It's a place with a lot of juju or something. There's still sort of unfinished business down there somehow. It's a really fascinating, beautiful, but also disturbing place, and the subject of those last 60 pages or so.
It's also a beautiful place. My family went out there and we scuba dove right off that point.
We have time for one more question. Al?
Oh no! Again, this is like a bad theme, but I don't make enough money to hire an assistant, and also I went to school for a long time. I have an undergraduate, master's, and PhD. I'm good at research. I like it. That's what I like better than the writing. Even if I had boatloads of money, I don't think I'd ever hire an assistant. Oh, usually, well, during COVID, I wrote a book on privateering in the American Revolution. That only took me 14 months because I had nothing to do. I was home all the time, but usually it takes me about 18 months to 20 months to finish my part of the book, and then it goes to the publisher.
I've hired some assistants occasionally, to help me kind of figure out where things are, where the bodies are buried, which archives are worth going to. But when it comes down to actually doing the research, I have to do it myself because I cannot describe to someone, perhaps a young student, what it is I'm looking for. Often I'm looking for some weird fact or an irony or some silly thing that, often I'll be reading a newspaper account and then I'll see an ad over here that's more interesting. Like my eyes will wander over here to this funny ad or this funny little thing that says something about the times. How do I tell a researcher, to look for those little factoids or those little incidental things that I think make the book more interesting, but it's hard to describe what it is I'm looking for.
What Hampton just said is really important. It's the things you find that you weren't looking for that often are the most interesting.
Yeah. Oh gosh, hey, what about AI? The question was, and that's a good one to end on. It's going to change our world in all kinds of ways. I'm involved in a lawsuit actually against Microsoft and OpenAI, and there's some major changes coming in publishing and that have to be dealt with, and it's too big a topic to get into now, but it's. Maybe by the next Mississippi Book Festival, it will just devote the entire festival to talking about AI.
I don't think AI is going to be writing history books, or at least good ones, anytime soon.
True.
But it is going to make major changes. I haven't experienced it in the research realm because ChatGPT and AI only became sort of a real thing about 8 or 9 months ago. And by that point, I'd well finished this book. And the current book I'm working on, I've already done all my research pretty much for it. But maybe it will, and that lawsuit is going to be interesting to see what happens.
Well, I think we have run out of time. I hope y'all have enjoyed it. Thank y'all for being here. Thank you.